first speaker, Linda Vasquez, who's here from the University of South Florida, and she's going to speak to us about the topic you see on the screen, which is forms of intertextuality in user-generated online reviews.
I haven't done anything to deserve that yet, but I want to start by sort of saying that if I had the iPhone app that Rodney showed us yesterday that measures your mood and takes a picture and sort of applies one word to how you're feeling, I would say that feeling right now is grateful. And I'm grateful to be a part of this beautifully organized event, and I'm also grateful to have had the experience of being here for 6 weeks. So thanks to the generosity of the Department of English at CityU and also the Fulbright program. So in this time I've had a chance to interact with a number of different scholars and students about these very topics that we're discussing today and yesterday and tomorrow. Online discourse practices, and also ostensibly making progress on a book that I'm writing, which has been challenging given all of the distractions that Hong Kong has to offer. But my book is looking at the discourse of online reviews, and so this is a genre that we haven't sort of talked about very much, but I see it as sort of an extension of the two talks that we just heard. So if children are being positioned as consumers when they grow up and become adults and consume products, they might engage in forms of discourse practices in constructing these types of texts. And a couple of talks have mentioned intertextuality, and hopefully I'll be able to make some links between what I've been thinking about and some of the comments of other presenters. I'll do my best to do that. As I mentioned, I'm writing this book, and so in order to begin, I had to create a corpus, a sample of online reviews, and that process was rather tedious. It involved a lot of copying and pasting from the internet until I had a sample of about 1,000 reviews, which was sort of just large enough to be sort of representative, I think, but still small enough for me to be able to handle it both literally and metaphorically. And in the midst of this tedium, every so often I would come across a text that would sort of strike some interest in me, or give me some pause and go, oh yeah, that's. And so I'd like to begin with an example of exactly one of those texts, and this was a restaurant review on the website Yelp, which posts a lot of reviews of local businesses, among which are restaurants. And it kind of made me smile, and I started actually tapping my foot as I read it, and you might sort of understand why. And so I've also given you just a very short soundtrack to sort of test your knowledge of popular culture. Sort of Didn't take you very long, though. So exactly. So the reviewer here is engaging in a form of intertextuality that is drawing on the structure of an existing text and a popular culture text, in this case, to construct the review. And this made me smile for a couple of different reasons. One of which I think is that, obviously I recognized the intertextual reference, the song by The Who that provided the structure for the review. But then the reviewer combined the song that was written, I guess, almost 50 years ago now, with an experience of dining at my local taco bus establishment down the street from where I live. And so it was this juxtaposition of two disparate realms of experience that created this reaction in me. And I think that post-structuralist theorists might call this reaction jouissance, or sort of a expression of aesthetic delight, which I might gloss in more vernacular terms as, gosh, that was kind of cool. Right? And the use of cool here on my part is deliberate, because Yelp as a website encourages reviewers to post reviews that can be evaluated by others according to these three parameters of, is it useful, is it funny, and is it cool? And in my opinion, this particular text was cool. Maybe a little funny, or at least entertaining in some respect. As far as its utility, I guess we could debate that. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot of information. It was evaluative in some sense of the restaurant, but there was sort of a lot of repetition using that chorus structure. So my assessment of this review was a little bit different than Yelp's algorithm, and we've been hearing about algorithms on other websites. And in fact, Yelp has an algorithm that it uses to applies to all reviews that are posted. And reviews that are deemed as suspect by the algorithm, probably due to a number of different features and factors, Yelp doesn't exactly disclose what those are, it sort of puts certain suspicious reviews in the filter where they remain, and so it's kind of like an online limbo or quarantine. So we can still access those reviews, but it requires clicking a couple of extra times. They're sort of separating those out for us. And supposedly this leads to content which is more reliable, right, as opposed to some opinion spam or fraudulent reviews. However, in this case, I think that what happened was sort of my ability to understand the intertextual reference was not something that could be programmed into the algorithm, and so it missed this. It didn't understand the text in the same way that I did. Perhaps that's an argument that I'm making. So intertextuality is something that we've heard a little bit about, and there are a number of theorists to whom one can turn to find definitions. But I'm using this very generic, broad definition, which is that all texts bear some traces of earlier prior texts, right? So all of our utterances, all of our writing, all of our tweeting, all of our texting, I suppose, is shot through with the words of others. And sometimes those references are intentional and deliberate, but I think probably more often than not, they're sort of below the level of consciousness, so we don't even realize that, you know, what we're saying sounds like what our mother told us 30 years ago, or whatever the case may be. One of the authorities that I found on the topic of intertextuality from the perspective of literary theory and literary studies is Graham Allen. And he says that in late modernity, intertextuality seems to be this really useful term for many of us because it foregrounds notions of relationality, interconnectedness, and interdependence in modern cultural life. And if we think about the kinds of digital practices that we've been discussing for the last 2 days, I think that those 3 adjectives are sort of apt descriptors. It's also important, I think, as Alan points out, that all texts derive their meaning in relation to other texts. Just as my understanding of that particular review depended on my knowledge of that magic bus song by The Who. Intertextuality is a common phenomenon, I think, in some of different modes of aesthetic production, and so we may be familiar with intertextuality in the visual arts, and we saw some examples in Alana's presentation this morning, also in cinema, in music, in dance. And sometimes those references, again, are very overt, like we see here in these images, but very often they may be more difficult to trace or to identify. I'm also interested in thinking about this in terms of non-aesthetic texts or sort of quotidian texts, like these online reviews that we don't necessarily assume or equate with a mode of aesthetic production, but there is sort of a creative element, as we'll see. It turns out that intertextuality is really a big, broad umbrella term for what is a wide range of discourse practices. And you can think about it sort of in fine-grained forms like repetition, making reference to another text or allusion, paraphrase, citation. These are all forms of intertextuality that as scholars and academics we're quite familiar with, and in fact they've been studied extensively in scholarship on academic writing. But it's not only in academic types of texts that intertextuality turns up. It also turns up in oral modes, for example, oral narratives, personal narratives like second stories that Neil Norick and others have written about. So when I tell a story about the time that I went to the beach and I got a really bad sunburn, and that prompts somebody else to tell a story about something similar or related, that too is a form of intertextuality. And then this last point, I think, we saw, again, illustrated in that first example, and that is maybe more subtle and difficult to detect, and that's the drawing on the discursive or stylistic conventions associated with a given genre. And it may be the genre in which one is participating in the creation of a text, but it may be importing conventions from a completely different genre. And so to give you sort of just another illustration of what that looks like, but in a different sort of text, I have just a brief clip, and this is from a TED Talk. And what this is it's not too gratuitous. I think it's only about 20 seconds. But this is a stand-up comedian delivering a performance, but he's drawing on the conventions of a different text type, and it's an electronic text type. And again, I'll see whether you figure out what he's referring to before the audience in the video does.
Dear sir, good day, compliments of the day, and my best wishes to you and family. I know this letter will come to you surprisingly, but let it not be a surprise to you, for nature has a way of arriving unannounced. And as an adage says, originals are very hard to find, but their echoes sound outer. So I decided to contact you myself for you to assure me of safety and honesty if I have to entrust any amount of money under your custody. I am Mr. Michael Bangura, the son of late Mr. Tiamu Bangura. Finance in Sierra Leone, who was killed during the Civil War.
All right, so that laughter comes in at the moment that one recognizes that this comedian is referencing a different genre, and I think that Jan Blomart has a really brilliant chapter in his book on discourse and globalization about that particular electronic genre of emails. And so I'll be talking about all of these different forms and illustrating them. But before I do, I want to make some reference to some scholarship that's been done on intertextuality that's specific to computer-mediated communication. And so Greg Myers, for example, in his work on the discourse of blogs and wikis has talked about linking, and specifically hyperlinking, as being a characteristic of those genres. Even earlier, our friend David Crystal, who was mentioned this morning, talked about message interpolation, and that is where you copy and paste just a segment of a prior post in order to situate or contextualize your comment that's going to follow. And I think the more recent expression of this is the Twitter retweet, if I'm not mistaken. Ruth Page writes about that in her book on stories in social media. In addition, there has been work on more general forms of intertextuality, that is, intertextuality that takes place across a broad range of discourse types, not only in CMC, but how it turns up in CMC. So Caroline Tagg has written about the utility of repetition in text messages as creating a sense of coherence in a form of communication that's often asynchronous, and particularly useful for individuals who have those really, really old phones that don't show you the immediate message that preceded, what you're going to respond to. And Paige has also talked about second stories, like the kind I mentioned just a moment ago, appearing in online discussion forums. So, for example, people talking about health or illness maybe will share a narrative of personal experience, a digital narrative in this case, and that will be followed up by somebody else saying, yeah, that happened to me too. Let me tell you about the time this happened. Okay, so I mentioned this is today's presentation is part of a larger study, and I'm looking at multiple topics, and I have texts from different online review sites that I'll show you in just a moment. But the sort of online consumer reviews are a form of social media that's often overlooked, as some of us were just discussing. There's been some research on this genre, but mostly from fields like marketing and economics and business, because there is a fiscal impact. And those folks tend to call this genre EWAM, or electronic word of mouth. The topics that I'm concerned with are evaluation, identity, involvement, and intertextuality, which actually overlap in some interesting ways, and narrativity. And I decided to just focus today on intertextuality, which is sort of almost too much to address in this time, but I'll do my best. As I mentioned, I've collected these 1,000 reviews from 5 different sites, and I wanted to get a range of reviews of different types of products and services, and also with different, let's say, financial relationships. So reviews of hotels, movies, consumer products of different price ranges, restaurants, and recipes. So, a negative review of a hotel can have a major financial impact, right? Whereas a negative review of a recipe doesn't really affect anyone's bottom line too much. So that sort of has something to bear on the kinds of texts that are produced. Okay. Again, the kinds of forms that I'm looking at, I've sort of made this crude distinction between micro forms of intertextuality, repetition of others' words, reference to other reviewers or what other reviews indicated, references to other textual sources, both online and offline. And I came up with this sort of taxonomy inductively as I was looking through my data. And then the larger category of drawing on conventions of other written or spoken genres, which are maybe more difficult to link to a particular word or phrase. These may be more structural, as we saw. I'm going to start with looking at the repetition of others' words. As I mentioned, there's not a lot of scholarship from the perspective of discourse or sociolinguistics on this topic, but there are a couple of early studies that have been really useful to me, including work by Jo Makiewicz, who positions her research in the fields of technical and business communication. And she characterized online reviews as not fully interactive in the sense that they don't facilitate discourse that coheres with the discourse of other users. And I'm seeing this is starting to change in the data that I've collected, and granted it's been a few years since Jo collected her data. But she looked at recipe reviews as well, and so I'm going to focus this part of the discussion on recipe reviews. And she said that reviews on allrecipes.com, she describes them as reactive rather than interactive communication. And she sees them as only responding to the original discourse, that is the recipe that's posted online, that source text, and only referring to that. I would say that that's an accurate characterization about 90% of the time, but there are exceptions, and the exceptions are always where the richest kinds of examples are found, I think. So this is kind of just a typical recipe review text that one finds on Epicurious, and we might say that there's an indirect intertextual reference to the recipe, to the source text, right? Made as directed by the recipe. That's about it. You see that this is kind of a discrete standalone text. There's no other linking or reference to any other texts. But I want to show you an example that's quite different and that makes use of the review space in a slightly different way. So this is mushroom tortellini, and it's good that I guess we've all had lunch already and we're not hungry at this point. Mushroom tortellini, I don't know if any of you have ever made it. It's like a noodle, and you make the dough. You have to let the dough sort of sit and cool, and you roll it out, cut it into shapes, fill it with the filling that you've made. I mean, it's sort of a time-intensive, laborious process, one might say. And so this was one of the recipes that I chose for my data set, and so I was looking at reviews for it, and an interesting thing happened. So a couple of reviewers, I guess, responded to the recipe with a sense of incredulity, like, why would anybody make this from scratch? You must be high. What a waste of precious time. And what I've done here is highlighted words and phrases that are going to be picked up and repeated by subsequent posters, right? So this is the first review that sort of starts this thread. It's almost like a threaded discussion, even though most reviews sort of exist in isolation. So another reviewer posts, who in the world has time for this? This sounds so tedious. So again, you see this time being picked up. Can everyone see that? Are they called? Yeah, okay. But a third person sort of joins the dialogue, and I guess polylog is really a better way of describing this interaction because there are multiple voices being introduced here, and this individual takes a different perspective and says, yes, it's time consuming, but some of us really enjoy cooking, and if you don't, then what are you really doing here, right? And then at the end of this comment, responds to this accusation of you must be high. I may have sipped a little wine while cooking, but was never high. And so this really has nothing to do with the recipe itself. There's nothing about getting high in the tortellini recipe, I can assure you. So here the reviewer is responding to another reviewer, and so here we have a very interactive kind of discourse. And you may notice that the default on this particular website for identifiers is a cook. And sometimes people customize that user ID and will insert their real name or some kind of abbreviation, or sometimes their geographical location. So we see here that this particular individual is from the state of Washington. The next reviewer simply agrees with Washington, right? So no reference to the recipe itself anymore at all. This is only a reference to the ongoing interaction. We see more of this again. So the repetition of Washington, from scratch, time, and so forth. This continues. And again, tedious, time, Epicurious, from scratch. This example is pretty interesting because the individual, although there's a typographical error here, and he means recipe or not receipt, But this person even admits that I haven't made the recipe, I have nothing to say about the recipe, but it made my day reading these reviews. So orienting to the sort of entertainment value that exists in some of these online texts, even though that may not be their primary function, although Yelp maybe has tapped into something, sort of recognizing that it may be a secondary function. And here we also have the discursive construction of a community, what a diversity of people we have in the collective first-person plural pronoun. What happens towards the end of this discussion is a few more individuals respond, again, sort of saying, you know, this site is about this kind of activity, and it's the audience are these kinds of people, so if you don't enjoy cooking, what are you doing here? And then similarly, this final comment, again with an intertextual reference, this time quotation, waste of time with quotation marks and tedious in quotation marks, so direct quotation. And again, sort of saying, underscoring the shared community values of this particular website. Okay, so we see different forms of intertextuality serving a couple of different functions, and we do see some interactive discourse, which has been characterized previously as not so interactive, right? Maybe it doesn't happen all of the time, but it does happen some of the time. And those sort of the tension of what's typical and common and normal and unmarked is important to, I guess, in any kind of description like this, but it's also important to look at what's possible. And I think this maybe ties into some of the critical literacy practices in subverting the intended intention of particular sites and spaces. So shifting now to a different form or type of intertextuality, I mentioned that there are references to prior reviews, and this is actually probably the most common type of intertextuality that's easily mapped and identified. And again, I'd like to draw on probably the earliest work that I found that took a linguistic perspective on online reviews, and Irene Pollock did a study that was very much corpus-driven, genre account of online reviews. And she too said that these reviews remain in isolation. They're generally not textually or hypertextually linked to other relevant information. Well, we just saw in that previous example, that's not always the case. And then the second sentence sort of kept sticking in my mind as I was reading through my data. In a few rare cases, reviewers took up what other reviewers had written. And I wasn't sort of looking at this systematically yet, but I thought, gosh, it doesn't seem like what I've been looking at confirms this. It seems like there's a lot of, oh, I agree with the other reviewers, or I, you know, like this other guy said from Washington, I have a totally different opinion, or I share his opinion. So here's sort of a quantification of a couple types of intertextuality across my data. And so sort of just looking at this first column, reference to other reviews, out of 1,000 reviews, there were 148 references to other reviews. So 15%, you know, that's not a tiny, it's not very rare, I would say. It's maybe not the most common, but it does occur. What's a lot more rare, though, is self-reference. So reviewers referring to their own reviews, and I'll show you an interesting example of that. That's not very common. But I think we need to pay attention to things that are not common, because who knows, maybe in 5 or 10 years' time, they will become common. We don't know. The conventions are still evolving and haven't been solidified, I would say. And then there are references to other kinds of textual sources, and I'll break those out in just a moment, and that's almost 200 out of 1,000. So taken collectively, this is, you know, almost half of the reviews have some kind of very easily identifiable form of intertextuality happening. Okay, so we'll take a look at reference to other reviews, and I want to show you some examples. So, and I want to show, I sort of tried to include examples from across the different sites so that you would see that this is a phenomenon that doesn't just happen in one community or on one website, but is maybe more applicable to the genre of online reviews. So we see a recipe reviewer saying, I think it's essential to follow the advice of the person from Northern Virginia. And we saw that regional location as being, serving as a default identifier in some cases. Or a film reviewer saying, some of the reviewers here are overly critical, missing the point. So two different perspectives. We see, you know, sort of agreeing or affiliating with the perspectives of other reviewers, or disaffiliating, disaligning with others' perspectives. And the function here, I think, is to situate or contextualize a reviewer's comments with what has come before. So the reviewer is positioning themselves as a reader and consumer of online reviews and not just a producer, right? We sort of touched on that distinction earlier today. But I found another function as well, and it was one that I was rather surprised to find. This, of course, is somewhat obvious, but I found things like this. We had read the reviews and knew what we were getting into. That being said, it was worse than what we expected. And I mean, even one reviewer even said something like, having read the other reviews, we brought our own disinfectant for the bathroom. And I thought, why would somebody do this? Waste their time going online, reading all these negative reviews, and then staying at the hotel anyway. Right? What could possibly, what could they be thinking? And another similar text, I think, answers that question, or maybe sheds some light on how readers process this information and what they do with it. So I call this ignoring, so reading and not heeding the reviews of others. So here's another example from TripAdvisor, and this sort of, I think, illuminates what's going on. So the reviewer says, my boyfriend and I read every single review for hotels in Dublin, perhaps an overstatement, but then orients to the process of decision making. And we decided that this hotel sounded fine, and that the noise could not possibly be as bad as people said it was, right? And that decision is based on what? Probably an assessment of demographic categories. We're in our early 20s and we want to go out at night. So there's at least the assumption that those other reviewers maybe don't share those demographic or lifestyle categories, right? So their comments, their experiences, and their needs are quite different from my own, and therefore I can maybe feel comfortable ignoring what these individuals have said. Of course, the moral of the story is they were all right and we were wrong. Go figure. Okay. So coming back to this quotation from Pollack, in few rare cases reviewers took up what other reviewers had written. She found that, I think she had about 350 reviews of digital cameras, and only 2% of her reviews had some type of intertextual reference, whereas this phenomenon of referring to other prior reviews turned up in my data 15% of the time. That's kind of a difference, and so I think we can speculate on some reasons why. Maybe the norms of interaction were different on the review site that she was looking at, or what I think is happening here, maybe there's more of a diachronic explanation, and that is that over time, 2006 and now we're in 2013, so it's been a significant amount of time, and there simply are many, many, many more reviews online now for other review writers to refer to. So I think when I started looking at TripAdvisor reviews in about 2008, 2009, there was something like 30 million, and now that number is close to 60 million. So just on TripAdvisor, the number of reviews have doubled in a couple of years. So I think if we go back earlier, the numbers are staggering now. I mentioned self-reference, and self-reference is interesting. Self-reference appears on Yelp a couple of times in my data. And so here and there's some reasons for this, I think, and Yelp cultivates that. The website architecture of Yelp is set up very much like a social networking site. So Yelp reviewers can create profiles, and they can friend other Yelpers, and sort of the more Yelp friends you have and individuals in your circle, your elite points are increased. This is sort of starting to sound like some of those gains, I think. And so this individual, this is an interesting example for a number of reasons. I think we see some involvement strategies, some forms of direct reader address. If you've read my other reviews, you'll know that I lived in San Francisco for 15 years, but what you don't know, right? So really reaching out and engaging the reader. But also there's this assumption in that first clause here that there may be sort of a set of people who are following me and reading my reviews, and it's possible to do that. Like on Yelp, you can follow a particular Yelp reviewer and read all of, sort of track all of the reviews that they've written. Amazon allows you to do that as well. And so that may seem slightly egomaniacal, but it's realistic in some sense. And I want to, I wonder if any of you have heard of Harriet Klausner with respect to Amazon reviews. She's sort of an interesting person. For many years, she was Amazon's #1 rated most prolific reviewer, and I think there were something like 160,000 book reviews attributed to Harriet Klausner. And people were trying to unseat her from this title, and there was a lot of sort of controversy around whether she was actually really writing the reviews and how useful they were, and that she followed a structure that was really formulaic, didn't really tell you anything. In addition, there's a blog here, tongue-in-cheek titled the Harriet Klausner Appreciation Society, still up and running. where people sort of calculated how many minutes it would take for her to read each book and write each review for this to be real. Right? So crazy phenomenon. She even had an article written about her a couple of years back in either Time or Newsweek magazine. So she's had her 15 minutes. And while achieving this kind of notoriety by becoming a really prolific or popular reviewer is probably not something that's going to happen to most people, there is a form of sort of micro-celebrity, I think, that happens on some of these sites. And Kathleen Kuhn has written a really nice dissertation on Yelp in particular. And so Yelpers do say that, yeah, there are certain reviewers whose style I like, so I'll follow them and I'll read their reviews. And so definitely for some individuals it's a powerful form of social capital, and that's what keeps them coming back and writing more reviews, right? Because this is an unpaid form of prosuming. Okay. Turning now to that third column that I had that was about 20% of reviews that have references to other textual sources, which I've conceptually divided into offline sources and online sources, but we're going to see some blurring, of course, of those boundaries in these examples. And sort of just roughly, I would say that it's split about 50-50 in terms of how many refer to offline sources versus online sources. And so here, the Yelp reviewer situates their commentary in terms of popular culture, mass media, food shows on Bravo or Food Network, for example, what these experts have to say about food before sort of sharing their review of the restaurant. Another example here is from a film review where the reviewer talks about the plot turning into a Deus Ex Machina and then provides a dictionary definition in case other readers are not familiar with that Latin term. So needing to clarify or sort of having this educative function perhaps in that case. So those were some offline textual sources that were being referred to. There are also some online sources that get brought into the text. And this was another sort of debate, not as contentious as the great mushroom tortellini debate, but it was a discussion about a lamb dish and whether it was kosher or not to eat lamb for Passover. And so this particular reviewer thought, sort of to clarify things, here's this link, somebody who presumably is an authority on the topic, and you can read more yourself by clicking on this hyperlink. A lot of the online sources that get referred to in reviews are YouTube videos, Phil, and also Wikipedia is often referenced, and we'll see some examples of that. In fact, this is a really nice sort of comparison contrast. So these are reviews of teas. So I looked at everything from tea reviews to reviews of high-speed blenders to get sort of products that cross different price categories. And so both reviewers here are really interested in the health benefits of tea. And on the left, you see the reviewer drawing on an online source, Wikipedia, but even within that quotation, there's an embedding of another source, right? So a reference to a study published in the Journal of Human Hypertension, whether that's online or offline, probably both these days. But so there's that particular reference. In comparison, the other reviewer draws on the label, the product label. So the tea box says that it's healthful in this way. But in addition to these quotations, that sort of smaller form of intertextuality, we also have other discourse systems being invoked, or large D discourses, right? So the reviewer on the right is situating the remarks within the larger discourse system of Western medicine and clinical trials and published results in medical journals, whereas the reviewer on the other side is talking about engaged in this discourse system of traditional medicine. It's an ancient remedy. It's been around for 2,000 years. So those larger discourse systems are implicated in these smaller forms of intertextuality, whether that's intentional on the part of the reviewers or not. Okay, I'm coming up now to that final category, perfect, and that's reference to other communicative genres. So going back to the kinds of things we saw with the Magic Bus, Taco Bus restaurant review. And I'm going to talk about a couple of different genres. So one, of course, is conversation, and by now it's completely cliche, I think, to describe online discourse as a hybrid between spoken and written, but we do see a lot of forms that are conventionally associated with speech in online reviews. So things like discourse markers, forms of second person address, which I've highlighted, also sort of simulations of the kinds of talk that we do when we're physically co-present, look, listen, those kinds of imperatives, wait. And this phenomenon, which I find absolutely fascinating, and I think this is a nice example of intertextuality, so drawing on some of the conventions of speech, but also turning up as a form of involvement. So here's sort of a simulated dialogue in which the reviewer is predicting something, a claim or a charge that a reader might have. So yeah, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say this following thing. Well, let me tell you. Normally I'd agree with you, but this time you're just wrong. Nobody has said anything here. This is a one-way asynchronous monologic interaction, right? But it's simulating having those other voices by including those other voices in the text. And again, Taco Bus is pretty popular here. Another genre that's invoked that we see getting drawn upon is the epistolary text, so letter writing. And this is an Amazon review, and at the very end we have the author signing their name, signed Wife of D. Butler. Well, this really isn't necessary in online reviews where you can, even on Amazon, you can use your real name. The site encourages you to use your real name, and that name, that ID, is attached to your review. So this is kind of a redundant piece of information. But we see this happening across different kinds of review websites, those which allow people to self-identify as well as those which do not. And another sort of, I think, vestige of letter writing turns up in the form of PS. And so back in the day before we had word processing and we had to write by hand, and then we'd run out of room in our, on the second sheet of paper, and then we'd have to include, add a PS because there was that little bit of information that we forgot to include in the text. Obviously, with word processing, we can cut and paste and insert anywhere, so there's no reason to add a PS. That little piece could go anywhere, but I think its value here and its function is much more symbolic, and I think it's a way for the reviewer to show, hey, there's this little trivial piece of information I want to share with you, and it's not really central to my message, and here there's a story about a little mouse in the dining room, right, which isn't really that important given the global evaluation of the hotel. I think an explanation for this is offered by Barbara Johnstone, who writes that newer text types like email and web pages draw on older text types because new situations call for new combinations of old communicative strategies. And I think that when we think about electronic word of mouth, maybe a predecessor of that was writing letters to businesses if you weren't happy, or writing a letter to the editor. And so that's probably the most similar text type that existed before we had the opportunity to do this digitally. So another genre that is invoked occasionally but not often are literary genres. And in this particular example, this is a film review of the Spanish film Beautiful with Javier Bardem. And this reviewer decided to write the review in the form of a haiku. And this isn't necessarily very common in my data, but it is common online, on the internet in general. So you can sort of search haiku reviews and you'll find blogs and Twitter posts and Facebook updates and all kinds of web pages with people writing reviews of books and music and film using the form of a haiku. And again, informationally, is it telling us a lot about the movie? It's telling us maybe just a little bit about the movie, right? But in terms of its function, it's maybe a little bit more creative or ludic, we might say. And this is a very interesting example. This was the only one of its kind. You probably can't read it all, and it doesn't matter. I'll sort of summarize it for you. This is an Amazon review for a high-speed blender, a piece of kitchen equipment that costs about $500. And the reviewer here begins the text by sharing a personal narrative. She got her blender for Christmas, and it's really because of her husband's health issues that are due to a diet soda addiction. And so what she does then is insert what I'm calling an activist discourse, this aspartame kills message, which is sort of, our attention is drawn to it, I guess, because orthographically it's emphasized and the asterisks around it, but it's not referred to metalinguistically anywhere within the text, so it just sort of appears. And the form of it is like something you might see on a protest sign or on a newspaper headline or something like that. And in fact, this is intertextual in another way too, because about half of the review, which really doesn't say much about the blender other than having acquired it at some point, half of it consists of 2 recipes. So she's inserting recipes into her review of a blender, and she's not really evaluating the blender itself, and then she's also inserting this message. Yeah. We can talk about these recipes and whether they're healthy and whatever, perhaps afterwards. Finally, I think that the most obvious genre that gets invoked or indexed here is the language of advertising. And so what I've done is given you just a selection of these kinds of advertising-like messages that appear on Epicurious. And so we see comments like, and these are all excerpts, like short little bits that come from longer recipe reviews. It's the recipe that keeps on giving. Love at first bite, right? This is something you might hear in a commercial or read in a print ad, but it doesn't tell us any specific, precise information about the dish being reviewed. So it's interesting that reviewers are kind of borrowing or drawing on discourses from mass media, commercial texts, and it's curious to know whether they're doing that deliberately or whether they've sort of been influenced by that and they're appropriating that discourse in this context, drawing on those older forms, as Johnstone says. Okay, to wrap things up. Hopefully one of the things that I've illustrated is that we've talked about intertextuality, but it can take many, many different forms in online reviews, and I imagine it takes many other forms depending on the kind of digital practices that we're looking at. And also different forms of intertextuality are associated with different functions. So it may be that intertextuality is a device to position myself as a reviewer against the background of what others have said. That may be one function. Delivering a personal message that's really meaningful to me might be another function. Something I hope to have stressed also is that some forms are a lot more common than others, right? So reference to other reviewers is going to turn up a lot more than the online review in the form of a poem, for example. However, I think they're all worth studying and useful to analyze because their functions are different. Something that I may have mentioned but haven't really developed too much in this talk, and I'm trying to do that in the chapter, is showing how intertextuality intersects with involvement in discourse. I think that mushroom-tortellini interaction maybe showed some of that. So there's the repetition and quotation and paraphrase, but it's also creating a sense of involvement among reviewers, but also for readers of those reviewers as they orient to the entertainment value of those polyglots. And as I mentioned, online reviewers engage in really a broad spectrum of intertextual practices. So to me, it makes sense to break out intertextuality into different types. The functions are often creative. Sometimes they have ludic, aesthetic, or, as I mentioned, deeply meaningful functions for the review writer. And then I think this is sort of the final point that is a good note to end on, that the activities, the intertextual practices, what we see may be consistent with the website's goals of offering an evaluation of a consumer experience, or they may in different ways subvert the original purpose of the review text and serve the interests of the members doing the posting or the larger review community. And I think that perhaps this connects somehow to the conversation that we were having before the break in terms of how do we approach critical digital literacy pedagogy. I mean, this may be one way of educating individuals that here are these spaces that are intended to do something, but you're an agent and you can use it for other purposes as well, and it's sort of up to you, and you're limited by the constraints of your own creativity.
We're going to follow the usual routine of having our two speakers speak and then followed by discussion. Is everybody comfortable? Or is it a bit cold? Or?
No. Give some to this young lady. And give some to the young lady. Not scared. Oh, the giant duck.
They reinflated it yesterday.
Oh, really? It got deflated?
Yes, they didn't know it was terrorism.
Oh, so cute, that photograph in the harbor. I love it.
Even the water was just kind of corroded through.
It's cute.
I don't know, that was my interpretation, just melted.
But it just shows you how small the harbor has grown. It's like a bathtub now, right? With all that, yeah, it's a bathtub of a harbor.
All right, everyone, thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor David Barton, who's from Lancaster University. He's going to speak to us today about tags as vernacular practices.
Thanks. This is my latest photo that I've uploaded onto Flickr, so do look at it. I need more hits. I made it titled Yellow Duck Before Deflation. I've been here more than 10 days, so for those of you who've only just arrived, I probably should explain that the main talking point in Hong Kong these days is this work of art down on the harbour front, this colossal sort of going on to the side of the cruise liner that became deflated and got taken away. But I was down there with this photo. I tagged it. I wasn't thinking about this talk, but I tagged it Yellow Duck, Hong Kong, and pre-deflation. I also joined it in to various sets that I have. I added to the set the photos I've got called Colours, and I added, that's my set, and I linked it up with other people's photos by adding it to a group called Hong Kong and a group called All Animals. Imagining that it probably get taken away from there, but it is still in All Animals. Okay, the origins of my talk, my interest in tagging. I've been researching lots of different aspects of Flickr and wanted to do tags and sent in an abstract which I later retracted and changed. Because okay, I said, I'll study tags, it'd be great. I started to look at the literature, which one sometimes forgets to do, and realised lots was done on tagging in 2005, 2006. And people got excited about the word folksonomy. And I like the word, it relates to my interests, it's what people are up to, it's about people's practices being brought together. But it didn't seem to be quite enough there. And the research mainly comes from information sciences, like library studies, or people who work for producers, like people who worked for Yahoo. So this research is all coming for some way. So that's hopeful. Then the other thing I was worried is it's a bit out of date. Everyone is shifting towards Twitter. We've already had it. Everyone wants to talk about hashtags, which is quite a different phenomenon. So I felt a bit stuck. But then I started looking and realising if you want a social practice view, you want to see what people are up to, then there's something still to be done. The points I want to make are, I see tagging, I'll explain what I mean, as a vernacular, meaning everyday writing space, and what I want to say is, it's not just a folksonomy, it's situated with a set of writing spaces on a website. It serves people's different individual purposes. I want to look at the sort of there's some structure to tagging, some sort of linguistics, maybe we can even call it a grammar of tagging. Here's an example of some tags. What I did was the research with Carmen on multilingualism we had a set of data. I looked back through those and looked at what was going on in the tagging. Something I pursued was 365, where people take a photo a day for a year. I've written about learning on that. Well, I would look back at those and looked at what's going on in the tags. So that's my data. And it's worth pointing out, this is from, well, you'll see it in a minute, but it's from a set of tags: the Met, Metropolitan Museum, Museo, Egyptian Sculpture, NYC, NY, New York, New York. And originally it was in a vertical line, and Yahoo keeps messing around with the layout, and especially this week, everyone on Flickr is up in arms because they've changed everything. Just absolutely terrible. And people always find changes absolutely terrible, and often they love them 2 weeks later. So originally this was a vertical thing. They can do something with verticalness. I think you can write a whole paper on this. This is of a couple of weeks ago, 150 most common tags on Flickr. They're gathered together, and this is a particular visualization, and you know it, you're familiar with it, where size means there are more, it's a tag cloud, those sort of things. You're used to these visualizations. We've had lots of visualizations before. We've had Rodney's and other people's. I've noticed quite a few visualizations. Nice one on technology use. They shape how you see it, and there can be problems in what they're showing or not showing. We'll come back to that. The tags, lots of nouns, including places. You look at your favourite city, Chicago, England, Germany, Japan, Italy. You build up a sort of sense of the world. Lots of adjectives of colour. D, W. Yellow. Yellow is there. Not duck is not one of the most common. Wedding is one of the most common. 17 million photos tag wedding. There's a few that come up automatically. If you're on Instagram, your photo automatically gets tagged Instagram. That's why these ones are very high. And Square, I think again, gets automatically put in. Canon and Nikon used to. But if you look, you see a way of life, really, wedding. But I kept looking beyond these 150, and every part of speech is there. I try to think of things that won't be a tag. Whenever is a tag 492 times. I thought, well, okay, whence is a tag 213 times. There's lots of dikes. Here, 80,000. There, 46,000. As you can see in the middle, me, 4 million. And what this does is pull the tags out of their context of use. And I was so pleased, I looked back at what I had done with my duck, and pre-deflated. I'm the only person who ever used that word. I don't know if the word exists at all. That's just great. Okay, so let's start with the what's wrong with the notion of folksonomies. In this research from 2005-06, they're all complaining at what they get when everything gets aggregated like this. The number one gripe for those happier with more formal classification systems is tagging terms used in these systems are imprecise. It's the users, which means that the tags are often ambiguous, overly personalized, and inexact. There's an uncontrolled and chaotic set of tagging terms. They're used for flawed purposes. There are too many nonsense tags designed as unique markers that are shared between a group of friends or co-workers. It goes on. I like the word feral. Lots of them are just feral. How many? Well, one study said somewhere around a third of tags are malformed, and they'd be beyond the grasp of any sort of automatic spell checker for some reason or another. So if you've got something where there's something wrong with a third of them, maybe there's something wrong with what you're doing if you can't take account of a third of the data. So that got me excited and realised there could possibly be a paper for today, and I sent in a new abstract. Okay, this is one of the Spanish speakers from the multilingualism study, and it was her tags you're seeing there. And what are people up to really? I once used the word curating. I'd say she's got her Flickr site where she decides what it should look like. And Flickr photos are different from Facebook. They're put up there to last a while, to document, to say, you know, I took more than 50 photos of that bloody duck, and I decided this was my nicest one, this is my favourite one, out of more than 50. And, you know, it'll be up there for years, and it'll be part of the history of Hong Kong. That's what happened this year. So what are people up to? What's she up to? She's got a title, Look at Me in the Eye, and tell me what you think of me. A bit of intertextuality there from a song, lots of intertextuality from songs on Flickr. Egyptian sculpture at the Met, NYC. And these are writing spaces. You can do different things. You do certain things with titles, you do certain things with descriptions, another page somewhere else where you have a different genre for your profile, you do different things with comments, and then there's this tagging space where people do things. What she's done is actually repeated every bit of information that's over there. There's nothing new in here, everything is over there as well. It makes a great coherent and cohesive text across modalities as well. You know, eyes are there and there, and those sort of things. That's a sculpture, it gets called a sculpture, those sort of things. So quite a sort of tight thing. I want to investigate, once you've situated, what else is going on and what info is lost if something aggregates it and just sort of takes it away. You lose the rest of the page, you lose the other writing spaces that it is relating to. So, there is some good things in what they did in 2005-06. Marlowe and another whole group of people, including Dana Boyd, who worked for Yahoo, looked through and got a set of constraints or affordances of tagging. And the point that's got to be made is tagging is very different on any site. You go from one site to another, tagging is different because the way it fits in with everything else that's going on is different. And they studied Delicious, now quite an old site, another photography site where you tag things with Flickr. They provide six aspects of tagging which can vary. Tagging right, who can do it? On Flickr, anyone can do it, but normally it's the person who produced it, and they tend to do it at the time. They put up the photo, they put up the tags, and I think they then sort of tend to leave it. And very rarely someone comes along and adds a tag to my photos. Tagging support, do they get suggested? Can you just put anything? And Flickr's moved over time, and if you hover over it, I think you get, if you start writing, you get some that you've used already. But you would never be suggested someone else's tags. So there's tagging rights, tagging support. Aggregation, how are they pulled together? How are they presented? Are they in statistics? Are they visualizations? And here you've seen one of the aggregations when we looked at the tag cloud. The material, well obviously on Flickr it's images. The source is usually the user. It's sort of frowned upon, but people do sometimes take other pictures and sort of, you know, maybe old historical ones. I put up some photos from 100 years ago where I took a photo of the photos, but that's not sort of not normal. The source is usually the user has just photographed it recently. Material, the source, the resource connectivity. You can group different people's images together. You could put all the yellow ducks together somewhere. And the social connectivity, you have contacts. You have people whose photos you regularly look at, and it doesn't have to be reciprocal. They can regularly use. So you can imagine are all those things could vary. So, as I see it, the designers provide a space within which people act, often creatively, to do with their purposes. People often do the unexpected, and that's what affordances means. It means people do what they're going to do, and often it's unexpected. And I hope we see some examples of unexpectedness. Okay, I like this one. Do you know it?
No.
I thought it was you for a while, but I realised you're sort of fitter, tougher for a while. This is from a friend of some of ours, Dr. Jules. Very little writing about it, no explanation. And some photographers like the photograph speaks for itself. It's quite old now. Anyone, what is it? Where is it? Anyone got an idea?
Oh, it's an AERA, isn't it?
I'm sure you were there.
I was there.
I'm sure okay, if you look at the tags, you get totally new information, and the people in this room may be able to work out what this means. If you just had UKLA means
United Kingdom Literacy Association, I feel I'm being tested.
okay. If you take these away from each other, take them away from the photo, take away from the context, there are 191 photos tagged UKLA. Most of them are about Los Angeles, some of them are about someone's Lego army, and also the association of a sailing boat called a laser. Very few of them are to do with the UK Literacy Association. It's not a common tag on it. But also the word Bath. If you search Bath, you'll probably, I don't think you should search Bath. You get some of the city, but not necessarily a lot of them. So I wanted to show that example. Let's move to my 365 project. You take a photo a day for a year. It's quite a challenge, a lot of people give up. As I was saying, I was talking yesterday, I think, people see a challenge and they get super involved in it if they keep going, and often have a support group who like or hate each photo. It's a great photo. 1/365. Do I have to go? That's the title of it. And then underneath it says 26th of November, dreaded trip to the dentist. Can't make much sense of it. I think it's a great image for starting. You know, you're starting, you've got a gate. If we look at her tags, I'll read it. It starts with the 365. Project 365, 365, gate, leaving, going out, dentist, torture, make, field, garden path, teeth, tooth, pain, dread, appointment, Canon EOS 400D, my day, snapshot, glance, day one. First, starting, digging my heels in. Countryside, rural, Bungay, Suffolk, me, life stress, everyday, my everyday life. Okay, I think you get a lot from that. You get an idea of the photo. Please come in. Okay, she's using it in an interesting way. Mostly they are straightforward words of all sorts of parts of speech. There are some places, there's any colours there. My everyday life would count as sort of an unformed thing, or Project 365 would. Further on, when she's part way through, I won't show you the photo. Waiting, watching, Tulip White. Check out the time I took this, didn't even know White so far before. I almost didn't take anything to me. First time ever. Too busy. ARG. And that's a 5A ARG. She has 4A ARGs and 3A ARGs. And she has several of them. This isn't a unique one. Project 365, just move that to the end. Day 118, 118/265. So that's partway through. And note, the set of photos are also important. We often think of photos as being sort of an individual thing. They're always sort of much more related and parts of that. Then we come to our last day, and I've really looked at a lot of people's last days because they're usually interesting. And I should just point out, that's her mum, and she's got some balloons saying 365. Final Full shot, 365. How did I get here? Time to let go now. Mixed emotions, helium balloons, massive. She nearly took off, bless her. I took around 500 shots and they lined properly in two. Exclamation mark, exclamation mark. That's my mum, obviously. Hillside, very windy, but at least it wasn't raining. Eek! Exclamation mark. I finished. Project 365, day 365, 20th November. Phew. I think you can see a difference from beginning to the end. She's got even more in it, and she's obviously sort of telling stories of that. And when you think of all those writing spaces, she's had a very sort of creative way of using that. If we want to have an overlook of what she's up to, these are her 150 most common tags. And you can see there's towns, there's animals, there's duck in there, I was pleased to see, so she put duck there. Interested in ducks as well. She's got that up my everyday life. Most of them are pretty well formed, world through my eyes, those sort of things. So I think that's the view you get from the 150 most common. If you look at all her tags, which are given in a long alphabetical list, let's just look at the first few ones. I mean, if you look at all her tags, it's sort of hard to see. Well, there are words. There's academia and academic and accessorize. There's so many other things going on. It starts at second line, a big hug for all of you who are also feeling it right now. A bit cliche, but me. And these are just the A's. So it's not a general folksonomy. And as I said, things like the day without rain is quite very common, not that common in England, but is used quite a few times. It's quite a good one. And I'd like to just show you one more like that was in the old vertical style. And this is someone's set of tags on the front. Hi, I'm bored, it's midnight. FML. And there are two photos of a tag like that. Maybe you think I've chosen the exotic. I'd say this is quite a typical thing from the multilingualism study, Spanish speaker from Latin America. Still here. Her title is Still Here, and I'd say this is a tip of that data. This is a typical tag set. Adriana, couch, Sion, Spanish, code switching, Casa de mi bro, brother, I guess. Then thinking of you, smiling, and she's got it's funny, she's got a 3A ARG, so ARGs seem to be quite a common sort of tag. Brother house, Adri, self-important, self-portrait in Spanish, black and white in Spanish, me in Spanish, English, and Italian. So some of them are straight tags, some are quite factual, but not actually tag-like. Thinking of you, things they're quite tags people quite often use to express stance. Some affect is very, very common. I guess ARG is a form of, I don't know. Unless you know what she's thinking of you and what the ARG means, it's quite hard to see. Something else to say like that. Okay, I'll just be quick with this. Here, these are her 150 most common. And again, you get the sort of thing, hey, we got yellow in Spanish, that's right. Amarillo. And in English. Okay. She isn't a duck, does she? No ducks. Right. I'll just talk about a few other tagging practices on Flickr. And I'm allowed to use my own data because this was partly autoethnography that I was in college studying her site and I was studying my site as well, so it is allowable. I like this photo, and I put up some tags on it. I just put up 4 tags. I put up Glasgow Botanical Garden flower orchid, which is, you know, places and nouns. Botanical garden would be counts on form. And then, I think, yes, I just suddenly found this added. That's another user added it, and I clicked through to who had done it and then see what they did. And they have a site full of orchids, and by doing a bit of tracing, they seem to, if an orchid comes along, they find it and they are tagging it. So they are building up a taxonomy, and I like the multilingualism, that the Latin, you know, goes across English and Spanish, and I guess in Chinese it's probably also called through its Latin name. And that sort of searching was also someone like, I've got a butterfly that I didn't know what it was. I actually put somewhere, great butterfly, no idea what it is. Someone added a comment within a day. I don't know, that they must be seeing all the butterfly ones that come in, and they told me what it was and that sort of thing, and added something. Do you know the artist Anthony Gormley? He did The Angel of the North in Britain. He's done lots of sculptures of himself around the world in cities. I don't know if there are any in Hong Kong. When I flew here 10 days ago, as I was coming out of the airport, someone's holding up a sign saying, Anthony Gormley. That's so amazing. And there's a big art fair on this weekend. I imagine he's going to, or maybe he's going to put some of his sculptures up there. So I just wanted to stay there and see him or take a photo, but he was usually a bit tired when he got off a plane, and he probably wouldn't have wanted to talk to me. Okay, so I put up my tags of this, and I put Gormley. This is on a beach. This is on a beach near Liverpool in England, and there are along the beach, covering like a quarter of a mile and going out into the water. There's about 100 of these, and people just come and wander around about them, or you bring a T-shirt of yours and put it on them, and then take a photo, which is what I did. Gormley, so it's called another place. Crosby's the place. Liverpool, Rust Beach statue, Iron Man, weathered Anthony Gormley. So I woke up the next morning and someone had added GAPC. I couldn't work it out. I mean, maybe you're smarter than me and can work out what it means. I couldn't work it out. This is really bizarre. Gormley, another place, Crosby. Okay, so this guy, he didn't ask me, he just put it up. The Angel of the North, every Angel of the North image, he's put G-A-N. So he has a coding system. Maybe he works for Gormley or something like that. Maybe he's just obsessively interested. And when Gormley had a statue in London, at Trafalgar Square, there's something called the Fourth Plinth. He actually asked people to use G4P for Gormley, Fourth Plinth. So there are people going around organising, regularising what we're doing and doing taxonomy. So there are sort of quite different things going on. And this thing about, you know, our taxonomy is dangerous. Do people sort of mess up? Another use, the Library of Congress in the States has put all its photo collection online with no copyright. And they just added LOC, Library of Congress, is the only tag they added, and they asked people to add tags. If you go to their blog, they're ecstatic. They think it's absolutely great what the American public have done to identify photos, say which battle the photo was in, or who the soldiers were, or where the president was visiting that day, and they're just sort of over the moon and enthusiastic about how people have added the information. And there are other good examples of this from other museums. I know a local museum in York, which is trying to put all its stuff on and invites local people to say, you know, where, you know, that was in 1933. I remember when the tram had an accident in 1933 in that very bad winter.